We've seen Marx's early philosophical works that are still sources of hugely fertile source of ideas for later theorists. But he himself moved on from thinking of himself as a philosopher to thinking of himself as a scientist. Specifically, when he's writing his great work, his masterpiece, Capital, or Das Kapital, as I always thought it was called, because obviously it was written in German. And in that work, he claims to have uncovered the way that history works, the way that human societies evolve, and among other things. So we've already seen that his early works include reference to historical materialism. Well, in his later works, he describes a process of how this plays out. This is most clearly and explicitly stated in something called the 1859 preface. And that gives you a very short summary, a very short and quite explicit summary of how this is supposed to proceed. And as Jonathan Wolff says in Why Read Marx Today, there's some controversy about this because it's a preface to a book that Marx allowed to go out of print and was replaced by Capital. So some people say, well, maybe this is an overly simplistic version, but at the same time, a condensed version of it is included in a footnote in Capital. So, and it's also the place where it's practically nowhere else in Marx is it so explicitly laid out. And essentially, the basic idea is what Wolff refers to as an architectural model of society. I'm going to read from that because it's so condensed and it gives you some flavor. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production. So relations of production are things like the relationship of the worker to the means of production. In capitalism, which of course, so Marx does a couple of things that we'll be looking at. One is offer an account of how human history develops through various epochs. One of those epochs, the epoch that we're still in and that Marx, that they were in when Marx was writing, is capitalism. Famously, the previous epoch is feudalism. Now, one of the innovations of Marx's is to paint this picture of development as not a sort of smooth development where, you know, we start with no technology and then we invent one thing and we invent other thing and then we sort of invent more and more things, and it's just a smooth picture of human history as steady development. That's not the picture. The picture is instead of sort of epochs which and the movement from one epoch into the next one is revolutionary and it requires great social upheaval. So it's a transformative moment when you move from one epoch to the next. And of course, the epoch that's coming, the transformation that's coming, according to Marx, is the end of capitalism, which will bring about the birth of the next epoch, which of course, according to Marx, is communism. And this is going to require great upheaval, which is a communist revolution. So Marx offers this picture of history as a series of epochs where the move from one to the next is great upheaval, revolution. So that's one thing. what's interesting about that is that it offers a view of capitalism as not sort of natural. The view of pro-capitalists tends to be that capitalism is just the way of the world. Capitalism is how things naturally work. That is, naturally humans are self-interested. Naturally, they enter into economic relations with each other. They buy things. There's a market. Capitalism, people talk about the free market and act as if capitalism is the natural way that humankind is supposed to be. If only we could get rid of all these regulations on the market, things would be as they're supposed to be, as humans naturally are supposed to be. Marx's view is, interestingly, he doesn't see capitalism as this evil thing. That tends to be the sort of stereotype of Marx, that he regards capitalism as evil and communism as good, and we've got to end capitalism and bring about communism. No, capitalism is just an almost inevitable stage in human development. But it is just a stage. And it's not necessarily of course, it's a stage that requires a certain level of human development before it is the appropriate stage. And before you have the right technology, it would be inappropriate. And so, for example, the previous stage, a little example he gives is, back to this architectural model. Notice the blue arrows means determines. So it's an economics determinism model. So technology, which is the productive forces that are sort of the foundation in this architectural model of society, the stage of technology that you're at determines the appropriate relations of production, and the appropriate relations of production determine the appropriate political, cultural, moral, legal, sophisticated superstructure of society. And the example he gives is the hand mill is appropriate for when you have the hand mill, which is a simple grinding mechanism, that is appropriate. Then feudalism is the appropriate economic structure. When you develop the steam mill, then capitalism is the appropriate economic structure. So you can't have capitalism before the appropriate level of technology. Now you can see this as a sort of Rousseauian critique of the social contract theorists who look on the early development of society as capitalistic, as driven by people who are much more appropriate to a capitalist level of development. Okay, so Marx situates capitalism as just one epoch in a series of epochs. I think slavery is before feudalism. So it's interesting, of course, that while he's writing this, slavery is still in effect in the United States. And of course, there is still slavery in existence in the world today. But he also, and perhaps the main contribution he gives, certainly in Capital, is an analysis of capitalism itself, because that's the water he's swimming in. That's the level of economic development, certainly in Europe at the time. But different countries actually are further along, and furthest along of the European countries was England. And given that, given Marx's theory of history, he envisioned England as being the place, or Britain more generally, being the place where communist revolution would and should happen first, because we'd had the Industrial Revolution, we had a more sort of secular state, we had all of the, we had, a larger GDP than Germany at the time. So Germany was pretty good, but England and Britain more generally was even better. We had factories, our exports were running well. England was the most appropriate place for a communist revolution. Least appropriate would be someone like Russia, because Russia was economically backward and was, if anything, still in feudalism. So that's the reason why many people were not happy at the communist revolution happening in Russia, because it was too soon. As we'll see, Marx says that a revolution can only happen, or should only happen, when the circumstances for the next phase have basically been developed. So communism develops in the womb of capitalism, is the image that he presents. And you have to have certain things happen in capitalism to lay the groundwork for communism. Otherwise, a communist revolution is too soon, and it's not, you're going to try and enforce relations of production that are not appropriate to your productive forces. Okay, so the basic idea is, let's read on. The totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society. The real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure. So it's kind of confusing that he has the foundation and the base. The base is where you have the economic relations. And for example, in capitalism, this involves one class of people, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, owning the means of production. So, and you have another class, the workers, the proletariat, who do not own the means of production. But in order to survive, they have to work for the capitalists, for the bourgeoisie. These are the capitalist workers of relations of production. They're different from feudalism, because, for example, in feudalism, the poor are essentially confined to a particular area, and they're on the land of a landowner, and they basically subsistence farm on land owned by the feudal lord. So they're not free to move around and go to where the work is. They're sort of tethered to one place. And this means that you can't have capitalism, because capitalism requires a mobile mass of workers that can move from one industry to the next, depending on which is the successful industry, because industries rise and industries fall. As you know, in Flint, we know that better than anywhere. So you have to have the right kind of workers. So, for example, under capitalism, Marx writes that workers are doubly free. They have no feudal ties, so they're able to work. They're able to go where the work is. They're not tethered to one particular landowner. They're not the poor of feudal lord X. They are in some sense, and that's the sense in which capitalism is an improvement over feudalism, because the workers are free. I mean, sometimes you get this clash between capitalists and Marxists over terminology. And, you know, capitalists always press, you're not free under communism. The great thing about capitalism is the freedom. And there's a sense in which Marx can acknowledge that. He says, yes, you are more free than the alternatives. You are more free than feudalism, for example. But he uses free in kind of an ironic sense, because the second sense in which they're free is a very negative sense. They are free from control over their fate, essentially. They have no access to the means of production. In other words, they can't set up their own business because they have no money to do so. A worker does not have the money to buy a mill, and therefore they cannot run the business. They have to work for the person who owns the business. All right. So, and this part is the Marxist social theory, because what it says is that the explanation for any legal, cultural, political structure or practice, if you want to explain it, why does this law exist? Why does this cultural mores exist? So, for example, the view under capitalism that not to work is immoral. That is, and you see this today where, after the pandemic, you had all these business owners saying, no one wants to work. And that's clearly pejorative. It's saying that these people have become fat and lazy. What's the matter with the world today? Whereas you have the noble, hard-working worker is the ideal image under capitalism. That's what you should be like. You should be someone who, we're Americans. Americans work hard. We roll up our sleeves and we get to work. That's an image, an ideal that is distinctively capitalistic. And why does it exist? Well, the Marxist explanation is because it serves capitalism. You want people who will work, who will gladly work and won't complain about working. You want them to work hard because who does their working hard serve the most? It serves the capitalist, because the capitalists are the ones who profit off the labor of the workers more than the workers do. So this serves this view, this that we think of as freestanding. We think that this is just the way things are. It's good to work. We see that as just an objective fact about the world. Whereas the Marxist view of history says, no, there are no such things. Everything is explained by, follow the money. Everything is explained economically. And these kind of attitudes are a byproduct. They are ideological. Ideology is this view of the world that serves the interests of the dominant class in a particular stage of history. And so the idea that theft and laziness are immoral clearly is in the interests of the rich landowners, the rich capitalists. Because who would you be thieving from? The rich. The poor don't have anything to take. So this idea that, no, you can't steal and you got to work hard. The reason why these are such cultural touchstones is because we're in a capitalist stage. So the way he puts it in the 1859 preface is, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. So it's not like, the capitalist view of how economics is you start from, well, it's good to work, you start from up here, and that leads to the kind of economic system that is appropriate. So yes, capitalism is the right way because we are capitalists. Capitalists are good. We're individualistic. We want to work to support our families. And therefore, what's the ideal system? Well, we'll set up a system where we can barter with each other, where anybody can succeed. Anyone can become rich if they work hard enough. So the capitalist model, ideological view is that it works the other way, that we set up our economic structures because of these ideas we had. Whereas the Marxist idea is no, everything is determined by, the true engine is the stage of technology, and that determines the relations of production, and then like the capitalists owning the means of production, the workers being doubly free. And then that explains our legal system and our cultural mores. And of course, what happens then is that when you set up the superstructure, it does have a kind of a trickle-down effect of ossifying, of entrenching capitalist relations of production. So when you have a legal structure that's set up to serve the interests of the capitalists, it means it's going to set capitalism sort of in stone for a long time, and it's going to be hard to undermine it. And then what happens is that the stage of technology keeps developing until the stage of technology would be more suited to the next stage, the next epoch of human history. But it can't develop because the economic relations and the legal superstructure are set up for capitalism. So originally the foundation determines these, but then these get kind of set in stone, and they hold back economic development. That's Marx calls that fettering. They are the fetters of the productive process. And when the fettering starts, that means you're on the sort of down slope of your particular epoch. That means that this epoch is going to start showing cracks because technology is not going to stop for anyone. Technology is, if anything, kind of beyond our control. As we see in the development of things like nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence, a lot of people are saying, you know, this AI stuff, you've seen the Terminator, this is not going to lead good places. But you're not going to stop people working on AI. They're just going to keep going until eventually AI and robotics is going to lead to a place where there aren't the same kind of jobs that there are anymore. And that's going to mean that the capitalist structure that says you don't eat if you don't work is not going to work anymore because there will be no work to do. So we can see something like at least a dynamic model of history like Marx's seems to make sense. And again, Marx, when he comes up with this, is viewing himself as a scientist. He's not saying that, capitalism good, communism bad. He's just saying, I'm describing how history works. It's going to happen. Although, having said that, the process, if that were true, if society is just going to march along, then eventually the communist revolution is just going to happen. And that's the economics first model of communist revolution. That economics is going to drive the move from capitalism to communism in the same way that Marx has a very convincing description of how it happened from feudalism to capitalism. That was a sort of natural development that didn't require sort of a huge political movement driving it. And if anything, a politics-first movement sounds like it's got it ass backwards, because then you have sort of you have the arrow going the other way. You have a political movement changing the political superstructure, changing the economic base. But if it's complicated, of course, because already the economic structure is fettering, is holding back the development of technology, which is not how things happen originally. So maybe when you get to the point of where the epoch is in its death throes and it's got contradictions that are going to destroy it, as Marx thinks that capitalism, even in the 19th century, was already reaching this point, that it was no longer appropriate to the era and the cracks were starting to form. Maybe when that happens, you need the final push to be provided by, in the case of communism, a large active revolutionary mass movement of the proletariat. All right, let's have a look at capitalism then? The beginning of Kapital, or Das Kapital, is about commodities. So, if you go to Capital thinking, I'm fed up with capitalism, I want something that is going to fire me up for what's to come, to instill a revolutionary fervor in me, you're going to be a little disappointed by reading Capital, because it is page after page of dry economic analysis, starting with an analysis of commodities. And he said, commodities, which are things that you can buy and sell, of course, have, he says, two kinds of value. They have use value. So the use value of a commodity is simply the value of fulfilling its purpose. It's why we have it in the first place. And in fact, in earlier epochs, the only value of an artifact, of something that humans had made, was its use value, because that's why they made it. So, the tools of Stone Age humans only have use value because they are valuable, which is why we made them. They're valuable to do the thing they were made to do. But under capitalism, at least, there's also their exchange value. Because in capitalism, you have this model of, in previous economies, in an undeveloped exchange economy, at least, you have this model. You have a commodity that you sell for money, and you use the money to buy another commodity. So this would be, if you remember Rousseau's discourse on the origin of inequality, this would be like stage 3, where you have villages and you already have division of labor. So you have some people who make shoes for horses, some people who make shoes for people. It's a shoe economy. There are other commodities, I'm just not thinking of them at this moment. But each person specializes, so they're good at making one thing, but they've got to eat. They can't eat the shoes that they're making, so they sell the shoes that they make so they can get money to buy another commodity like food. So it's a simple exchange. But there's no getting rich. There's just people exchanging goods for other goods. And the means by which they do this is the common currency. Now, but pretty soon, you're going to, for this to work, there has to be a decision made of how much each item is worth. Like, even if you didn't have money, you would have to know, is a pair of shoes worth 10 turnips or 9 turnips? You have to make that decision. So commodities very quickly have exchange value once you do this. And what explains the exchange value? Like, why would a pair of shoes be worth 10 turnips rather than 9 turnips? What explains the exchange value of any commodity? And Marx's answer is labor. The amount of labor that goes into each commodity determines how much it is worth of other commodities. So why would a pair of shoes be worth a coat? Well, if the same amount of labor was required to produce them. If 2 times the amount of labor was required for the shoes in the coat, then 1 pair of shoes would be worth 2 coats. So that's the labor theory of value as applied to exchange value. And it, makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, as far back as Locke, we've seen this basic idea. Locke talks about in chapter 5 of his second treatise on government, the chapter on property. He talks about how labor creates property and increases the value of land. Basically, Locke essentially justifies white Europeans taking land from Native Americans because we're the ones that give it value by cultivating it. Uncultivated land is essentially valueless. Of course, that's not true, and that is one of the problems with the labor theory of value. Nowadays, of course, land is incredibly valuable, completely uncultivated. So that can't be explained by the labor theory of value. And in general, although the labor theory of value is very intuitive, because what is it that can make something valuable? Because if you think of a product, the raw materials are relatively cheap. Like the raw materials that go into a car, I don't know how much you would have to pay for that weight of iron and plastic or whatever, but it is minuscule in comparison with the cost of the final car. So what explains the difference between the value of the stuff that composes the car and the car itself? And the obvious answer is the labor put in to transforming the raw materials into the product. That's what's been added to the raw materials, is labor. So that's the idea, that the exchange value is labor. So we can measure exchange value by the socially necessary labor. Because there are all of these puzzles that you can raise for the labor theory of value. Does that mean if you have, because actually, how do we measure labor? And essentially you measure it in hours, in time it takes for labor laborers to produce something. Well, what do you mean? Because my labor if you put me to work making shoes, I could work for hours and still produce a pile of crap. So it has to be, you have to work on this notion, and it has to be, so surely the labor of an expert, 1 hour's labor of an expert is worth way more than 1 hour's labor of a complete novice. So you have to add to the computation the amount of hours it took to train the expert. So it gets complicated, but essentially value is down to labor. Now, with that idea in mind, actually other puzzles is Picasso can, produce a sketch. Like my grandparents had a picture on the wall that was a Picasso sketch of Don Quixote, and it was obviously done with a fat marker pen and just like under a minute. But it's an amazing little sketch and sold for millions, of course, because it's Picasso. Why is it that, a minute of his labor is worth so much? That doesn't seem explicable in terms of labor. And also, if you're planing a plank, you produce two things. You produce a plank and you produce wood shavings. Both of them are products of your labor, but only the plank is valuable. So what explains the difference? That can't be explained simply in terms of the labor to produce them. So there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. But it is an intuitive idea, and it's not an idea that Marx himself invented. It has this long history. Okay, the question he wants to ask, first of all, Marx points out that labor itself is a commodity. That is, what is the commodity that the worker has to sell? Because they have to get money or they will die. That's the other thing. They don't have their own little plot of land under capitalism. They're free from feudal ties. They're free from property, if anything. So under capitalism, you have this sort of mass of people who don't have anything and will literally starve to death. What can they sell to get money to buy food? And the answer is they can sell their labor. That's what they have to sell. That's their commodity. Now, Marx was very proud of this distinction. He said there are two aspects to labor. There's a concrete aspect, and the concrete aspect of labor is what creates use value. So the value, the aspect of your labor that is concrete is basically the product that it produces. So you can say, what's the point of your work? And a worker can point to the thing that he or she makes. That's the point of my work. A potter can point to their pots. The abstract is the thing that creates exchange value. So there is this abstract aspect to labor that creates exchange value and is only measured by duration. And the weird thing is, under capitalism, they are at odds because there are competing requirements of use value and exchange value under capitalism. Think of the notion of planned obsolescence. Wouldn't it be great if you only ever had to buy one fridge? Well, back in the 50s, you essentially did. You know, there are all these things you can see on Instagram of people showing amazing 50s fridges that have features that we would love to have today. You know, trays that move around in very convenient ways. And these things were built like tanks and lasted forever. Nowadays, you know, you buy a fridge, you're lucky if it lasts 10 years. Why? Planned obsolescence. Because they want you to buy another one. Think of the Instant Pot, which was incredibly popular in the lockdown under COVID. They went bankrupt shortly thereafter. Those things exploded. Everybody had to have an Instant Pot, but the trouble is everybody only needs one, and when they bought it, they're not buying another one. What's that? Peloton had the same problem. Because what they need is planned obsolescence. They need you to keep buying things, otherwise that industry is going to die. So if you are producing, you want your exchange value. Wolff gives the example of a shirt. In the concrete, you want a good shirt because that has optimal use value. A good shirt is, you know, like a good tool, is most useful for its use. But at the same time, capitalism wants you to keep buying shirts, wants you to keep buying refrigerators. So that gives an incentive to make things that aren't so great, that don't do the job very well, because so that you'll want to buy another one. So that's the sense in which the two aspects of labor under capitalism are at odds with each other. Now, one of the key problems that Marx sees himself solving in the work Capital is, where does the profit that capitalists make come from? It's something that when you ask the question, you suddenly see, yeah, it is a problem. Why is it that the industrial capitalist who starts with money, buys raw goods, and buys labor and goods, and sells them for more money? So the industrial capitalist invests in a business, okay? They start with the money. So unlike the worker or someone in an undeveloped economy, you don't start with a commodity. The worker starts with their labor, that's their commodity, and they sell it for money, and then they buy other commodities like food and shelter. The industrial capitalist has money and is looking for a way to invest it. They invest it in a business and they make more money. They get richer. Capitalists, the bourgeoisie, get richer. How? Where is this extra money coming from? Because it should be the case that if the exchange value is correct, then the commodity that you exchange for money, this commodity is worth the same as that commodity, because this commodity gave you that money, which you spent on this one. So how is it that you can spend this money on this commodity and get more money back? This money is more than this money because that's the profit. M prime is greater than the initial M. That's the puzzle. Where does the profit come from? Why is this bigger than this? And Marx's answer is that labor is the commodity that's being bought. Of the commodities that are being bought by the capitalist, labor is the one that creates the profit, because labor is the one commodity that creates more value in its use than it cost. And whose labor are we talking? Not the bourgeoisie, not the capitalist, but clearly the worker, because it is the worker's labor that is a commodity. And so, whose commodity is producing the value? The workers. It's their labor. Who's getting the money? The capitalist. This is exploitation. This is the Marxist theory of exploitation. It is the extraction of surplus value. Okay, what's surplus value? You pay the worker enough so that they can survive a day. And that's one of the other things. Under capitalism, there are these forces that drive wages to the bare minimum. That is, workers will be paid, because why do workers work? Because otherwise they die, because they have nothing under capitalism. Capitalism succeeds when you have workers that will die unless they work. Now this is so for example, the worker can develop organizations that serve their interests. For example, unions. Unions are a means that provide the worker some bargaining power, because of course, if you say, look, you're paying me too little, I want more. You go to the boss and say, look, I want more. I'm not getting anywhere. My life isn't improving. If anything, it's getting worse. You're paying me enough just to pay the rent and to eat, and food prices and rent are going up. I'm going to die. Now, what does the capitalist do? Well, the capitalist looks around and finds, hey, there's another worker who will do the job. So you can just fuck off, and I will get that other guy, because under capitalism there is this vast army of roving workers who will do the job for less. So for example, a younger, fitter person who doesn't need healthcare. You're an expensive commodity because you're getting old and you need healthcare. But look, there's a young person coming along who's fit and doesn't think they need healthcare. I'm going to hire that person instead. What's to stop me? So this creates a drive to keep wages low. Okay, so you do need to pay a minimum amount of money, which is enough to keep the worker alive for the day in which they work. But suppose their 4 hours of labor produces that value of the value of their pay. But they work a 12-hour day. Particularly in Marx's time, of course, there was no minimum age. A lot of the workers were children. And, you know, they worked 12-hour days. So only 4 hours after they've worked 4 hours, they have earned their money. But they're not getting paid for 4 hours. They're getting paid for 12 hours. So the extra 8 hours is the surplus value. The 4 hours is the necessary value that keeps them alive. The 8 hours is the surplus value, and that's pure profit for the capitalists. They're doing work that creates exchange value that goes into the pockets of the capitalists. So you can see that under capitalism you have class antagonism. Marx has a whole analysis of economic class. And actually, that's one of the weaknesses of Marxian analysis, that everything in the superstructure is explained in terms of class antagonism. And I saw this in effect because I am so old that when I went to college, there was still an anti-apartheid movement, and Nelson Mandela was still in prison. And I remember going to an anti-apartheid conference, and there were these Marxist students there who wanted to explain apartheid in Marxist terms. That is, purely in terms of economic interests. And it comes to a point where you say, no, it's racism. right? Racism is not an economic phenomenon. Now, it serves economic interests, but there are other things that would serve economic interests as well. There are any number of isms that would serve the capitalists, but this is purely racist. This affects black people of all economic classes in a way that it doesn't affect white people of any economic class. So everything in the Marxist picture is explained in terms of class antagonism, and that doesn't seem to be true. There are all these other ways in which we hate each other that aren't purely economic. But anyway, certainly one of the key parts of Marxist analysis is to divide people into economic classes in a way that is not, as Wolff puts it, it's not a pure census thing. It's not, oh, you happen to be this, but it won't affect your, that's just what you are. That's just a handy means of classifying you. It is more than that. You are a member of a class, and that determines your life. And the class itself, as a body, has interests and can act as a solid entity. And that's, in fact, one of the things that we have to achieve to move forward to communism. The workers, the proletariat, have to achieve what's called class consciousness. They have to be aware of themselves as workers and as a group having this role in society, and as a group being able to end exploitation. Now, a sort of small version of this is unions, because under unions there is collective action, and the workers can act as a body, and they can prevent the capitalists just firing them and hiring cheaper workers like illegal immigrants, as businesses do in vast numbers, of course. Why are there illegal immigrants? Because there are businesses who will pay them. Why will the businesses pay them? Because they're desperate people who will accept low wages and know they can be fired at will because they're not even supposed to be there. They're the ideal worker, particularly because they tend to be very hardworking. So that's why there's illegal aliens in the United States. It's not for any other reason than that there are businesses that will hire them and love them because they can be paid shittily because they're desperate. They're the ideal capitalist worker. So why don't wages go up for supply and demand? If the business becomes successful, why don't laborers go? Why doesn't eventually you will? Suppose we close the borders. Eventually, you would run out of new workers. So you would have to pay the workers more because then there wouldn't be someone. You would, in theory, politicians and capitalists in general say the ideal is full employment. And capitalism leads to full employment if it's left unregulated. Marx's great insight is no, absolutely not. Capitalism would break down if there was full employment. Capitalism relies on a huge body of unemployed people so that creates a downward pressure on wages, and that's how the businesses are able to make their profit. Because if they actually paid workers what they were worth, they would make no profit. So in order for profit to exist in capitalism, it has to be that the workers are underpaid, and there has to be this downward pressure on workers' pay. So why don't we reach this point of full employment, at which point there is no one else to hire, and in order to make your product, you have to pay the workers more. If they come to you and say, I want more, there isn't somebody that you can hire instead, so you have to pay them more. Why doesn't that happen? Well, Marx says that because under capitalism, it's not a constant upward trend. under capitalism, you get constant boom and bust cycles. Marx was one of the very first people to point this out. And of course, it's something we're familiar with today. We have recessions every decade or so. We have, the most famous one, of course, was the Great Depression at the end of the 20s. But we've had them recently. We had one in 2008. They're just a constant feature of capitalism that Marx was really the first person to say this happens under capitalism necessarily. What happens is the wages go up. Okay, so there is a little bit of increased pressure on wages. And that creates a huge incentive on capitalists to look around for something to replace the worker. And they find technology. So the reason why they don't invest in technology when there's cheap labor is because it's not worth their while. And the example Wolff gives is there are in very poor countries where workers can be paid very little because they're starving otherwise. You don't get much mechanization. You get a lot in China until fairly recently, in India. You get people doing things by hand who are paid a pittance because they have to be, because they're desperate. So there's no incentive to invest big money in a large mechanized factory. But once the workers start demanding more money, and they're in a position where they can demand more money, then the capitalists would say, now it's looking a lot more worthwhile to spend money on a machine that isn't going to demand more money. So they do that. And then you get mechanization. And when you get mechanization, you get layoffs. There's a famous scene in the movie Roger and Me about Flint, a documentary about the collapse of the car industry in Flint. They built, when jobs were already leaving Flint and Flint was suffering this collapse, one of the things that the Flint city leaders did to try and keep Flint alive was build this amusement park called Auto World. And in Auto World, there was a sort of animatronic image of the happy worker working with the robot that was about to replace him. And, Michael Moore points out the sad irony there. And of course, Auto World didn't work because it was stupid and crappy, and nobody wanted to get off the freeway and come into Flint to go see it. But it was a striking image of the happy worker with the machine that was about to take his job away. And that happens under capitalism. It's just natural. So that leads to layoffs. But what happens when workers are laid off is that the workers are no longer consumers. When the workers are being paid, they'll spend money. They'll inject cash into the economy. They'll buy a new Chevy EV. They'll spend money on all these things. But when they're laid off, they don't. And of course, that's going to affect capitalists. Maybe not the capitalist immediately that laid them off, but somewhere in the economy, a capitalist is going to suffer because they were selling, the strip bars are going to really suffer when workers are laid off in a city because they were one of their main sources of money was workers after work. So they're going to be hit hard. All of these things are going to, they're going to have to lay people off, and it sort of escalates. And now, of course, you have businesses that were producing things that were popular because they were being sold to workers. Now there's no workers to buy them. There are no workers with money to buy them. So you're overproducing. You have too many workers. You lay people off. And, of course, it leads to this collapse. And until finally, you have this huge body of desperate unemployed people, and you can start hiring them back at minimum wage. And then we sort of climb our way out of it until the workers start asking for more money again, and the whole cycle continues again. So this is the cyclical nature of capitalism. And it's one of the threats to capitalism because Marx says this is going to get worse and worse. The boom and bust is going to get worse and worse. Now that prediction doesn't seem to have held up. and what Marxists have said about that is, well, capitalism is clever enough to make enough concessions that it sort of lessens the impact of the boom and bust. So this is like a, so for example, you might ask, why do things like unions even exist under capitalism? It should be the case that they're illegal. It should be the case that capitalism, the capitalist relations of production produces a legal structure that prevents things like unions because that's not in the capitalist's interest. Well, one suggested answer is, well, but it is in their enlightened interest because it prevents capitalism self-destructing. Because if you allow for these boom-bust cycles to get worse and worse and worse, capitalism is going to be destroyed. So you give enough concessions to the worker that protect your profit-making and exploitation of them, but stop them being so desperate that they are forced to revolt. Now, that view of ideology, it sounds plausible, but the trouble is, as the philosopher Karl Popper pointed out, is that this means that essentially the Marxist so-called scientific model can explain just about anything. It can explain unions being illegal, but it can also explain unions being legal. How do we test this theory if everything can be made consistent with it? And Popper famously said that Marxism was a scientific theory that wasn't scientific because it failed his falsifiability test. And if you want to learn about that, I've got a video on that. Look that up. Okay, that's capitalism. It's going to, the other thing is the falling rate of profit, that eventually, because of the increased mechanization, remember, it is the labor that creates value, and mechanization gets rid of labor. Human labor is the only thing that produces value. So the more that we become mechanized, the less labor there is, the less labor there is to produce surplus value, and so there will be a falling rate of profit, and eventually the capitalists are going to stop making money. Again, that hasn't happened. So that's a problem for his theory that Marxist economists have to account for. But according to Marx, eventually these kind of things are going to be the problems, along with the fettering, that lead to the end of capitalism. And the end of capitalism, what's going to come after? Well, obviously, communism. So what does Marx say about communism? And essentially, Marx says about communism about as much as Christians say about heaven. They've got some basic ideas of what heaven is going to be like. It's going to be good, but surprisingly little. Now, let's look at the few things that he does say, though. So, what are the necessary conditions for transition to communism? First of all, we have to reach abundance, because this is one of the problems with the Russian Revolution, that it happened before, well before, this never happened in Russia, that we reach conditions of abundance, that production, one of the great things about capitalism is that it does, it's this sort of turbocharging of production. It produces, as we've seen, for example, in China. Look at what's happened to China. Although China is politically so-called communist, or certainly Maoist, economically, they've basically changed to capitalism, and it has produced this amazing raising of the standard of living of millions and millions of Chinese people. Okay, so capitalism can do this until, of course, it can't do this anymore. So under capitalism, you create all these machines for abundant production. But of course, you also get the starving workers because the profit of all of this wonderful mechanization is going into the pockets of the bourgeoisie. They're creaming off all the profit. They're getting fatter and fatter while workers are getting poorer and poorer. Where does that sound like? Well, let's not get into that just before the election. Anyway, you have a huge amount of abundance. You also have the fetters. You have technology that is no longer being allowed to develop because it is contrary to the interests of capitalism, but actually has to eventually be developed because that's the way history moves. So you've got this fettering, and also you've got developing in the womb of capitalism structures that serve the interests of communism. And one interesting example is joint stock companies. Because one of the things that capitalism says about communism is that communism will never work because only capitalism uses a sad fact about humans for their own good. And the sad fact about humans that capitalists point to is one that actually we're familiar with way back from Hobbes, is that we're egoistic, we're greedy, we're selfish. Remember, there was a movie called Wall Street by Oliver Stone, and the main character, played by Michael Douglas, has this speech, "Greed is good." That's essentially the idea of capitalism, because in everybody acting self-interestedly in the marketplace, this works to everybody's advantage. So everybody being out for number one under capitalism works to everyone's advantage, because you're all trying to get ahead, and it works for society as a whole. And so capitalist criticism of communism is, under communism, you're not going to be out for number one, and there's going to be no incentive. Well, joint stock companies, say Marx and Engels, are a counterexample to that, because under joint stock companies, the people who manage the joint stock companies aren't the ones getting the profit. The ones that are getting the profit are the shareholders. So the managers have incentives to do well for the shareholders, sure, but it's the shareholders who are doing the best. So there you have a case of someone managing something for somebody else, which is what's going to happen under communism. Under communism, you're going to have people managing the economy for the good of the people. And capitalists say, oh, that'll never work, there's not enough incentive, but joint stock companies appear to be a counterexample to that. Large-scale industrial production is another thing that has to happen under communism because you need the abundance. And we do have that under capitalism. State-owned industries. Yes, one of the contradictions of capitalism is, number one, capitalism is supposed to work because of competition, right? Competition is supposed to be good under capitalism because that's what makes companies lower their prices and raise their quality. Because if I'm the only business that sells a certain kind of product, you have to buy my product. And I can charge what I like for it, and I can cut corners. But if somebody else comes along and says, I'm going to make the same product for less and better, then I either have to go out of business, or I have to compete and make my product better than theirs, or cheaper. So that's how competition is supposed to be one of the things that, this is one of the ways in which self-interest, the self-interest of the people who run each company, is to the good of the consumer. Because the person running each company wants to succeed, and it's going to drive them to make a better, cheaper product, which is good for the consumer. So this is one of the ways in which capitalism is supposed to use self-interest to the common good. But of course, what do we see under capitalism is one of these businesses is going to be bigger than the other, and it's going to say, I don't like competing with you, so I'm just going to buy you. And then, again, that destroys competition. So in a totally free market, you would get monopolies developing very quickly. And recognizing this, well, that's one of the problems with capitalism that is going to lead to its demise. Now, there's two solutions to this, and one of them was familiar to Marx, and that is nationalization of monopolies. So, for example, natural monopolies like post office, although, of course, that's not even a monopoly anymore thanks to FedEx and UPS, but natural monopolies are nationalized. They're controlled by the state. They're state-owned. Things like utilities tend to be state-owned. Because otherwise, if they're in private hands, then they'll just charge whatever they want, and it'll be bad for the consumer. So if there are things that people have to, and that's why, of course, under every advanced economy except this one, the United States, healthcare is state-owned, because that's something where if the monopoly emerges, it's greatly to the detriment of the individuals. So that's one way to fight the monopolies that are naturally occurring features. That's the sort of contradiction, one obvious contradiction of capitalism, that competition is for our good, but competition leads to monopolies that destroy competition. That's a contradiction under capitalism. But of course, what Marx wasn't familiar with is the solution that has been found in a lot of countries is to have monopolies commissioned, monopolies that are regulated by the state. So, for example, Bell was broken up, and now things like Google occasionally falls foul of this. Certainly more in Europe than it does in the U.S. But anyway, the solution that he was familiar with was the state taking control of monopolies. Well, if you have state-owned industries, you're halfway to communism, which is what right-wingers argue for, why they argue against nationalization, because it's too like communism. So they're sort of aware of what Marx and Engels were pointing out, that communism itself is going to produce these things which actually service its successor, communism, much better. Okay, there's two models of the communist revolution. There's the economics model, as I said, which is how feudalism turned into capitalism by pure economic forces. There's a description of it in Wolff, which is good. Whereas the one that Marx talked much more about is the politics first, and that requires organization, that requires setting up international workers' movements to instill revolutionary class consciousness. And actually, of course, even if you have class consciousness of the workers in one country, the capitalists are going to outsource their business. This is what happened to the car industry in Flint. At one point, Flint had the highest per capita average earnings in the entire country. Why? Because of unions. Because union wages became very good. So what did the car companies do? They said, screw this. Let's put our factories in Mexico. It's worth it to, because otherwise we're paying too much. We're going to have to lower our profits, and we don't want to do that. Let's find workers who are not unionized. So unless your revolutionary movement is truly international, and you've got international cooperation of all workers, the capitalists will find a way around it. Okay, what is it going to be like? As you ask of heaven, if you believe in it, what's it going to be like? Will I be, what age will I be in heaven? Will I have a body? Will I look like me? If somebody has Alzheimer's before they die, will they be cured of Alzheimer's? Back to what stage of their, all of these questions about heaven that Christianity has no answers for. What answers does Marx have? Well, one of the ways that he avoids it is this famous quote. He says, You don't make recipes for the cook shops of the future. I don't know where they got the translation cook shops, but it's a great word. We're not kitchens. Anyway, you don't make recipes for the cook shops of the future. What he's saying is I can't predict what communism is going to be like any more than, as Wolff says, a 15th century philosopher could predict what capitalism would be like. I don't know. I can't see into the future. I don't know what the technologies will be. But there's this other famous quote. Essentially, it'll be where you hunt in the morning. This is a quote from the critique. Is this the? No, the last one is the critique. I think it's from the German ideology. He says people will be able to hunt in the morning. Here we go. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in every branch he wishes. Remember in the previous video when we were talking about his early work on alienation, one of the problems of labor under capitalism is that the worker was alienated from his or her labor. That is not going to be a problem in communism. You will no longer be alienated from your labor. And the alienating feature of a labor under capitalism is a byproduct of mechanization, because labor is increasingly made simpler so that any worker can do it, so they can pay anybody without an education. But also it becomes mindless, and you don't know what you're making. You just know, I press this button, but you have no concept of the product that you're producing. Under communism, that will go away. You won't be alienated from your labor, so you'll get to do work that is more, like I said, like the hobbies that we all developed, well, a lot of people developed in, and the other people felt guilty about not developing under lockdown. Like making sourdough bread. That's the kind of thing you'll be able to do because there's abundance, there's mechanization. Most of the providing the necessities is done by machines, is done by technology, like the replicators of Star Trek maybe. So you're free to develop your interest. The work that you do, and remember, Marx's view of human nature is that the distinctive thing that makes us human, that we should do, is labor productively. That's what we should do. And that's one of the tragedies of capitalism, is that it destroys the value of that labor, the truly human, so it makes us inhuman, in effect, alien. Whereas under communism, this won't be the case. So in communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, nobody's just pressing one button, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. So society is producing because we have abundance, we have mechanization, there's no need to do the labor to produce the necessities. You have the necessities, so you're able to do all these different things. Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner. Do Marxist social criticism. Just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, cowherd, or critic. Because if you become one kind of thing, that is a sort of lessening of your humanity, of your your free ability to labor freely on anything you choose. So that's one suggestion. And of course, the most famous quote that is often misattributed to Jesus is, under communism, we have this inscribed on the banners of communism, we have from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So in other words, you're not just laboring for yourself. You just labor what you're good at because you enjoy doing it. And then the economy is organized so that this helps support people who are unable to labor or people who have needs that they can't satisfy. Because the economy is managed. Now, look at the attempts to do communism in the Soviet Union. Pretty grisly picture, although, I'm not sure politically that that Russia is in a great place now, but you have the critics of communism say that the Marxists say that the Russia was never the appropriate place to have a revolution. That's their response. The Socialist Society of Great Britain condemned the revolution in the 1917 revolution almost immediately after it happened as not Marxist, because it wasn't the place where revolution should have happened. So that's how Marxists point to the failings of Soviet communism, for example. But the critics, the non-Marxist critics, say the reason it inevitably failed because it's not human nature. It doesn't accommodate human nature in the way that capitalism does, because we're egoistic. Now, in response to that, communists say, look, and this is a point that we've already seen Rousseau make in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Egoistic humans are a byproduct of capitalism. We are made egoistic because we're desperate. If you're not egoistic in capitalism, you will die. You have to be egoistic. Who are the most egoistic people? Desperate people. Somebody is driven to crime because they're desperate. They're driven to hurt other people because they're desperate. So we don't know how egoistic people will be under communism. Maybe they will be much more altruistic. Who knows? So the capitalist criticism that egoism is human nature, just as Rousseau argues in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, human nature is a byproduct of its epoch rather than static. So we're not, egoism is not the way, egoism isn't baked into human nature. Coordination, that's a bigger issue. The one thing that von Hayek points out, who was a right-wing economist of the 20th century, points out about capitalism is that the market is amazingly good at coordinating what one person needs, coordinating supply and demand. It's like this amazing dynamic process by which what somebody needs is met by somebody else to both sides' advantage. So if you take away all markets and you just have a managed economy, it's very hard to be as abundant as under capitalism. Now, in response to that, you could say, well, we can't be as abundant anymore because we've used up all natural resources. We have to get a lot less abundant. We have to stop using resources. Capitalism has consumed the earth rapaciously. And now we have to move backwards to a more feudal-like existence where we live more simply. But even so, coordination, badly coordinated economies can lead to mass starvation, and that's a terrible thing. And another criticism is Marx believed that once you get rid of class antagonism, that is a byproduct of this particular classes emerge at certain stages in history, and the class antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie under capitalism is particularly extreme. You're going to have a classless society in a good sense, not lacking in the good kind of class, lacking in the bad kind of class. Economic classes that are antagonistic to each other. And once you get rid of that antagonism, once we're all in the same boat, there are no workers and bourgeoisie, there's just people, everybody will get along a lot better. and all kinds of social divisions will disappear. Well, that runs hand in hand with this explanation of all the social divisions in economic terms that I described earlier, of the people at the anti-apartheid conference explaining racism in economic terms. It's just not clear that that's true. Maybe humans are shittier than Marx thought, and we're racist, we have religious chauvinisms. We've been fighting for years for good reason, not just for economic reasons, but because we always find a difference between us and other people that leads to antagonism. And that's not something, and so that wouldn't go away under communism. There you go, an incredibly condensed snapshot of some of the many rich ideas to be found in the voluminous works of Karl Marx. Well, has certainly qualified it, and it becomes two maxims, and the point of view of society is represented. But he finishes on a note that libertarians would certainly improve on, where he says, the most cogent reason for restricting the interference of government is the great evil of adding unnecessarily to its power. That is, we don't want to increase government bureaucracy. And actually, he speaks approvingly of Americans. He says, every body of Americans is able to, let them be left without a government, and every body of Americans is able to improvise one and carry on that or any other public business with a sufficient amount of intelligence, order, and decision. Really. But he does certainly make it clear that we don't want the government controlling the interests of individuals. And even education, he does sound a bit like someone who would favor charter schools, because he certainly wants it to be the case that there shouldn't be a single state education. There should be education that is diverse. But remember, a lot of charter schools are set up to be religious schools. And remember his discussion of the religious bigot. You can't have schools just teaching one side of it. So it's kind of an odd balance. But there you go. Mill, the first hippie.